Shalom, welcome back. Tonight we're going to be talking about the documentary hypothesis. Believe it or not, this is something that really frightens a lot of religious people. They're definitely terrified of the documentary hypothesis. I've heard it compared to the theory of evolution. That is something that scholars are setting out there to try and disprove the existence of God or whatever. It's nothing to be afraid of. Let's put that out there right now. I believe it to be true. I don't believe it's a hypothesis any longer. I call it the documentary fact. But religious people don't want to hear it. I mean, they are terrified of it. They'll call you every name in the book to get you to stop talking about the documentary hypothesis. And yet, on the scholarly side of things, it's accepted. I mean, it's a fact, and it's provable from the Scripture. But I don't understand why Christians and Messianics are so terrified of it. But we're going to talk about it tonight. I've mentioned it in several of my videos, but I've never really done a video to just talk about this. So let's just get into it, and we will look at this documentary so-called hypothesis. The origin of the hypothesis is that there were three men that made this discovery in Scripture in the 18th century. One was a minister, one was a physician, the third was a professor. All three came up with this theory using the combination of two pieces of evidence: the doublets of the stories in the Bible and the variations in the name of the Creator. So basically, what this is the doublets would be where you have the same story repeated. For instance, Abraham goes down to Egypt, and Sarah is taken from him, brought into the house of Pharaoh. Yeshua has to intervene, give Pharaoh bad dreams and a plague upon his house. Pharaoh realizes that Sarah is Abram's wife and returns her to him along with riches. And then Abram and Sarah go on their merry way. And then again, Abram goes down to Shur, and Abimelech takes Sarah. And again, Yeshua has to intervene and give bad dreams to Abimelech and a plague. Abimelech realizes that he's taken Abram's wife, returns her to Abram, gives him riches, and then they go on their merry way. So it's a doublet. It's the same thing, the same story, slightly different details, but it's repeated. And between that and the variations in the name of the Creator, these men began to kind of separate these texts out. And then they realized that a lot of these doublets, in one episode of the doublet, the Creator would be referred to as Elohim. And in the other episode of the doublet, he would be referred to as Yeshua. And so then they began to separate out the text depending upon which name of the Creator is being used. And they realized that they had what was at one point two distinct works or two distinct texts, I guess I should say. One text would refer to the Creator as Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. The other text would refer to the Creator as Elohim. And the theory was that at some point in the past, these two texts had been combined into what we have for the modern-day Torah. So, for example, the opening chapters of Genesis tell us two distinct stories of creation. In the first story, in Genesis 1, plants are created, then the animals, and then man and woman are created at the same time. In the second story, man is created first, then the plants and the animals, and then the woman is created last from the rib of the man. In the first story, Yahuwah is always referred to as Elohim. In the second story, he's always called Yahuwah Elohim. In the first story, he's never referred to as Yahuwah. But in the second story, he's never referred to as simply Elohim. It's always Yahuwah Elohim. So this is another example of a doublet. So the first of these three people to come up with this hypothesis was a German minister named Henning Bernhard Whittier in 1711. He wrote a book which made very little impact until it was rediscovered 200 years later in 1921. The second was Jean Ostruc, a French professor. He published his findings anonymously at the age of 70 in 1753, but his work was largely ignored also. And finally, when the third person, Johann Gottfried Acorn, made the same discovery and published it in 1780, the world could no longer ignore it. Acorn was a respected scholar in Germany and the son of a minister. He called the text that referred to Elohim as the E-text, and the ones that refer to Yod-He-Vav-He as the J-text. The J is for Jehovah. So you got the Elohim text and the Jehovah text. So they're called the E-text and the J-text. And these titles, the J and the E reference, they're still used today. This is caught on, and so every scholar that speaks about the documentary hypothesis talks about the J-text and the E-texts. Now, the theory that the Bible's early history was a combination of two originally separate works by two different people lasted for only 18 years. Investigators soon discovered that the Torah was actually the work of 4 different individuals. The E document was not one document, but it was actually 2. There were still doublets within the E document, as well as differences of style, language, and interest. The difference in interest seemed to be centered around the priesthood. The third source focused on the priests, the laws about the priests, matters of rituals, sacrifice, incense, purity, dates, numbers, and measurements. This came to be known as the P source. So now we have the J, E, and P sources, and they ran throughout the first 4 books of the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But aside from a few lines in Deuteronomy, there was hardly a trace of them in the 5th book. You see, Deuteronomy was written in an entirely different style than the first 3 books. There are different reoccurring expressions, favorite phrases, doublets of entire sections from the first 4 books containing contradictions of detail between it and the others. Deuteronomy was determined to be a new, independent source called D. So now we have JEPD, and this hypothesis has stood the test of time for over 200 years. Now, there may be some differences as to whether a particular verse belongs in the J document or the P document or whatever, but for the most part, it really hasn't changed a lot, and it's been proven time and again to be a documentary fact. Now, to put this in terms that may be a little bit easier for people to understand, currently we have 4 different Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now imagine if, as sometime in the past, let's say 200 Common Era, suppose somebody had taken these 4 Gospels and had put them together and made them into one big mega gospel. And there's a number of websites that have done this, where you can go to and you can see, the story of Yeshua from all 4 Gospels, but combined into one narrative. So it's not something that's never been attempted, but just suppose it had been attempted early on in the history of the church, and once they were all combined, people stopped using the separate Gospels, and here we are 1,800 years later, and the 4 separate Gospels had been forgotten about. And then somebody discovers that, wait a minute, this big mega gospel book that we have actually used to be 4 different Gospels. And then they began to split it up into 4 different sources. That's all that we're really talking about here. Again, it's not anything that I see as something you should be scared of. Using my example of the 4 Gospels, if that were to be discovered and some textual critic were to say, hey, this one gospel used to be 4 different gospels, then sure, there would be plenty of religious people standing up and calling him a heretic and, oh, this is a doctrine from the devil and all kind of other stuff, but it wouldn't make it so. It would just mean that someone discovered something that was true, and so now we can take this truth that this one big gospel used to be 4 separate books, and now we can maybe use that information to learn a little bit more about what each particular author's intentions were. Not anything to be scared of, but for whatever reason, people are vehemently, like, spewing venom upset about anyone discussing the documentary hypothesis. Now, scholars don't get upset. It's only the religious people that get upset. So I'm telling you this just to try and, dissuade your fears and let you know that it's not anything to be afraid of. So let's look at one of these stories in the Bible and go through it and see if it maybe gives you a better idea of what exactly we're talking about here. The story of Noah's flood in your Bible is actually 2 different stories of Noah's floods, but they're combined into one source. It's a mixture of the J source and the P source. Now, I'm going to read through each story separately, and you'll be able to see that what we have here are actually 2 different versions of the same story. And for this reading, I have highlighted the J source in blue and the P source in yellow. So we're going to go through, going to read the J source. It may be helpful to you to even kind of look away from your screen for a moment while I'm reading it and just listen to the words, and you'll realize, like, wait a minute, this is, 2 different stories. So we'll do the story in blue first. And again, I have not changed anything or deleted anything in this version of the story. It's the same. You can open any Bible, and it'll look just like the text that I'm reading. Maybe a slightly different translation, but that's it. You can do this with any translation. So starting at Genesis 6:5. And Yahuwah saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And Yahuwah was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And Yahuwah said, I am going to wipe off man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping creature and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahuwah. And Yahuwah said to Noah, Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Of all the clean beasts, take with you 7 pairs, a male and his female. And of the beasts that are unclean, 2, a male and his females. And of the birds of the heavens, 7 pairs, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For after 7 more days I am sending rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and shall wipe from the face of the earth all that stand that I created. And Noah did according to all that Yahuwah commanded him. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. And it came to be after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And Yahuwah shut him in. And the flood was on the earth 40 days, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. And the waters were mighty and greatly increased on the earth. And the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters were exceedingly mighty on the earth, and all the high mountains under all the heavens were covered. The waters became mighty, 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. And in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. So he wiped off all that stand, which were on the face of the ground, both man and beast, creeping creature and bird of the heavens, and they were wiped off from the earth. And Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. And the rain from the heavens was withheld, and the waters receded steadily from the earth. And it came to be at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. And then he sent out a dove from him, to see if the waters had receded from the face of the ground. But the dove found no resting place for its feet, and returned into the ark to him, for the waters were on the face of all the earth. So he put out his hand and took it and pulled it into the ark to himself. And he waited yet another 7 days, and again sent the dove out from the ark. And the dove came to him in the evening, and see, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in its mouth. And Noah knew that the waters had receded from the earth. And he waited yet another 7 days, and sent out the dove, which did not return to him again. And Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and saw the surface of the ground was dry. And Noah built an altar to Yeshua, and took every clean beast and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And Yeshua smelled a soothing fragrance, and Yeshua said in his heart, Never again shall I curse the ground because of man, although the inclination of man's heart is evil from his youth. And never again smite all living creatures as I have done, as long as the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, all day and night shall not cease. Okay, so as you can see, there was a complete story in the J source. Now we're going to go back to the P source and read through. So again, we're going to read it, and this time I'm just reading the yellow. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, perfect in all his generations. Noah walked with Elohim, and Noah brought forth the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the earth was corrupt before Elohim, and the earth was filled with violence. And Elohim looked upon the earth, and saw that it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And Elohim said to Noah, The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And see, I am going to destroy them from the earth. Make yourselves an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with tar. And this is how you are to make it. The length of the ark is 300 cubits, its width is 50 cubits, and its height is 30 cubits. Make a window for the ark, and complete it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. And see, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth, to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under the heavens. All that is on the earth is to die. And I shall establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of all the living creatures of all flesh, 2 of each you are to bring into the ark, to keep them alive with you, a male and a female. Of the birds after their kind, of the cattle after their kind, of all creeping creatures of the earth after their kind. 2 of each are to come into you, to keep them alive. As for you, take of all food that is eaten, and gather it into yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. And Noah did according to all that Elohim commanded him. So he did. Now Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. Of all the clean beasts, and of all the beasts that are unclean, and of all the birds, and of all that creep on the earth, 2 by 2 they went into the ark to Noah, male and female, as Elohim had commanded Noah. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of the heavens were opened. On that same day Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and 3 wives of his sons with them, went into the ark. And they, and every living creature after its kind, and every beast after its kind, and every creeping creature that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2, of all flesh, which is the breath of life. And those going in, male and female, of all flesh, went in as Elohim had commanded him. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle, beasts, and every creeping creature that creeps on the earth, and all mankind. And the waters were mighty on the earth 150 days. And Elohim remembered Noah, and all the beasts, and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And Elohim made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided, and the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were stopped. And at the end of the 150 days the waters diminished. And in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased steadily until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. And he sent out a raven, which kept going out and turning back until the waters had dried up from the earth. And it came to be in the 601st year, in the 1st month, the 1st day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. And Elohim spoke to Noah, saying, Go out of the ark, you and your wives, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living creature of all flesh that is with you, of birds, of cattle, of creeping creatures that creep on the earth, and let them teem on the earth, and bear and increase on the earth. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping creature, and every bird, whatever creeps on the earth, according to their kind, went out of the ark. So as you can see, there are two distinct versions of the story of the flood. So it's not just it's not just that you're taking one story and splitting it apart. There's definitely two stories there. So who were these writers? They could not be Moses. It had to be people separate from him. And if you think about it, if you think about some of the things that Moses says in the Torah, it obviously can't be him that's writing it. For instance, Moses writes about Moses' death. So obviously he didn't write about his own death. Moses is also believed to have written the words, and Moses was the most humble person upon all the earth. Well, that's not exactly the kind of thing that the most humble person would write about themselves. And there's a number of times that it says that something was implemented in the days of Moses and as it is to this day. Well, that kind of gives you the impression that this Torah is being written long after the fact if it says as it is to this day. So things like this kind of gives you clues that Moses didn't write it and that whoever wrote the Torah wasn't claiming that Moses did. So what can we tell about the authors? Well, when you split it up into its 4 different sources, you begin to see some patterns in the text. And the patterns in the text kind of give you a clue as to who it was that wrote it. So the J and the E documents were likely to have been written during the years of the divided kingdom, probably right after the kingdom was split. J was written by a Judean from the southern kingdom, and E was written by an Israelite from the northern kingdom. J and E were combined first into what was called the JE source. So of these 4 documents, the first 2 that were combined was J and E. And then once J and E were combined, then P was added later. And the reason that we can tell this is because the J document seems to focus on events in the southern kingdom. It focuses on people from the southern tribes versus the northern tribes, and just kind of the political slant. You can tell that it's pro-Judean, versus the E document, which focuses on the northern 10 tribes. It focuses on people from the northern 10 tribes, Samaria, and so like the different cities in the northern territory. And so the political slant there is very pro-Israel versus Judah. Deuteronomy was probably written during the reign of Josiah. It was probably the Torah scroll that was found, and I put found in air quotes. It was found in the temple during the days of Josiah. In all actuality, it probably wasn't found then. It was written, and then the priest took it to Josiah and said that he had just found it. There's a number of reasons that scholars believe that, and that's pretty much the accepted theory. And then the P document was written last, probably during the Babylonian exile, and it may have even originally been an alternative to the J and the E document. So like the J and the E document had very little mention of sacrifices. In fact, the mentions of sacrifices in the J and E document appears to be something that was kind of added by the redactor at times. But the majority of the sacrifices, the elaborate sacrificial system, the one temple in Jerusalem doctrine it all comes from the P document. So prior to the P document, there wasn't, or actually prior to the D document. I think the D document talks about centralized worship in Jerusalem. But prior to that, like if you look at the book of Judges, it's obvious that there was not a centralized temple in Jerusalem. People had, there were little tabernacles and altars and stuff set up all over Judea, and people would just go to the nearest one versus having to go to all one place. So the centralized priestly monarchy came into play with the D document, and even more so with the P document. Now, just so you don't think that this is something that's just made up by a bunch of atheists to turn people away from the Bible, this was actually confirmed by AI in 2011. And so at the bottom of your screen, you see a web address. You can type that into your browser and read this article. But essentially, some Israeli computer programmers, they created a artificial intelligence algorithm that would look at text, and it could tell if it would look for different authors within a text. So you could tell it was meant to be for like forensical type of work, but it was there to specifically to see if it could detect any kind of multiple authors in a work. And it actually, with a 90% agreement to what scholars teach, it actually split up the text into priestly and non-priestly sources. And in fact, the only difference was, or the major difference was, that most scholars think that Genesis chapter 1 is part of the P document, but this artificial intelligence algorithm said that it actually belongs in the E document. So as far as what is the original Torah, it would either be the J or the E document. The E document would be the one that would contain Genesis chapter 1. The J document would be the one that has the creation story from Genesis chapter 2. If you want more information on this, now this video is just a general overview type of primer, but this book, Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman, I highly recommend you read it. It goes into a lot more detail. It speaks about, I mentioned that there were, appear to be like political slants to the different sources, and different reasons that they placed certain documents to be written in Judea and certain document was written in Israel. This book goes into the details about that. It actually gives you some pretty good insight into the political environment during the reign of King Solomon. So I highly recommend reading this book. I think it's a real page turner, very interesting. And like I said, this is not anything to be scared of. So if you're worried about where this leads, I mean, it shouldn't be anything frightening at all. Now, what about Yeshua? Would Yeshua, if Yeshua was who he claims to be, then wouldn't he know about the documentary hypothesis? It turns out that he did. In a couple of documents that I refer to quite often in my videos, the Recognitions of Clement and the Clementine Homilies, Simon Kepha is pictured as teaching this very hypothesis, the documentary hypothesis, in those works. So just some background, Clement was Simon Peter's scribe for a while, and he was given this mission by James to follow Kepha, write down everything he says, and then send me copies of the scrolls of the teachings of Kepha. And so then James was collecting these scrolls with the teachings of Kepha, and one would think probably all the disciples back in Jerusalem. And so the Recognitions of Clement and the homilies, the Clementine homilies, they're essentially two different versions of the same story of Kepha's preaching. In the same way that you have like Matthew and Luke, well, you have the homilies and the recognitions. And they're basically the same, but one version has more information than another, or vice versa. And in these documents that date to the very early church history, it has Kepha teaching what is really the documentary hypothesis. I mean, of course, he doesn't call it the documentary hypothesis. He doesn't talk about E documents and J documents and that sort of thing. But whenever he gives descriptions about the way the scriptures were put together, it lines up very, very similar to the documentary hypothesis. He talks about that Moses wrote down or gave the Torah in its perfect, pristine form, but over time, corruptions have been added to it. People have mixed in falsehood with the truth in Torah. And so now the Pentateuch itself was a mixture of truth and falsehood. In fact, this parable of the wheat and the tares that I've got on the screen here, I personally believe that was the original interpretation of the wheat and the tares. Now, I think somebody went in at some point and added in a explanation to that parable to the scripture after the fact, but I think the original version was this. So, anyway, I pray this has been a blessing to you. I hope that this has given you some things to think about, and I highly recommend looking into the documentary hypothesis. I thank you for listening, and shalom.